Good morning. As Gary said, this lecture started from a debate at the University of York, where I was a student many years ago. And one of my fellow debaters on that occasion was Kate Pickett, who is the co-author of an extremely good book called The Spirit Level, which sets out a proposition that Britain would be a more happy, contented, peaceful, stable society if it were more egalitarian. And as that fits with one of my core beliefs, I was required to think on that occasion about whether it's how that core belief coexisted with another core belief which I've developed over 20 years working in the education sector, which is that the sole job of the education system and of education policymakers is the pursuit of excellence. If not the sole job, certainly the prime job, and how those two things fitted together. And so what I want to talk about is the preconditions for excellence in education and how that sits with the pursuit of equality. And the rather uncomfortable conclusion which I've come to partly as a result of that debate and thinking about the issue, and partly as a result of experience over the years, that those trying to use the education system to drive greater equality in our society are inadvertently driving a stake into the pursuit of excellence. So, first of all, the preconditions for the pursuit of excellence. The delivery of excellence is something that governments can only influence to a limited extent. When my organization was responsible years ago for delivering the Blair government's national literacy strategy, it was a very successful strategy for a number of years, and then it plateaued out. And the government head of the program, Michael Barber, said, or he concluded as a result of that plateauing out, that you could drive or cajole schools to get from awful to adequate. But if you wanted to get schools from good to great, then they had to do it themselves. They had to take responsibility for leading the process themselves. And what's true of schools as institutions is at least as true of individuals and individual learners. In other words, you can't drive or cajole them very far. You have to have the great majority of learners, which means the great majority of parents, committed to the education process, committed to education as an activity. You have to have what I call a pro-education culture if you're going to attain excellence and certainly sustain excellence. So what does a pro-education culture look like? Well, for reasons which may be pretty obvious to you, one of the historic examples of a pro-education culture which impresses itself on me is the example of Scotland, where I was educated. Scotland had universal primary education, elementary education, about 200 years before most other countries. And it had that because of religion, not because of government. The Calvinist religion required there should be no intermediary between the people and God, between an individual and God, and therefore every man, it was men I suppose in those days, had to be literate in order to be able to read the Bible. And that had a profound effect on Scottish society and on provided a strong foundation for a pro-education culture. And the effects that had were really quite remarkable. Scotland had something like 10% of the population of the United Kingdom, but in the first 25 years of the 19th century, 70% of the members of the Royal College of Physicians were Scots educated. And it didn't apply just to doctoring, it applied to other professions as well, it applied to engineers. Indeed, the image of the Scots doctor or the Scots engineer became a sort of stereotype, really, which affected popular culture and affects popular culture to this day in small ways. I mean, it's not coincidental that the engineer of the Starship Enterprise is called Scotty. And Scotland punched enormously above its weight for the 18th and 19th centuries. And as I say, that continued sort of through to my day, in that teachers had a higher status in the community, really notably higher status than was the case in England, regrettably. Well, the contemporary equivalent of Scotland in the 19th century is the East Asian tiger economies. And if you look at the OECD results of the PISA studies, which come out every few years and came out just a few weeks ago, those tiger economies are doing very substantially better in terms of learning outcomes and attainment levels than we are in Britain. Now, there are some fairly unpleasant conditions that go with that. That children are being worked to an extraordinary extent and working all the hours that God gives. And that's, I think, unattractive and not something we would want to do in this country. But they remind us of something that we need to be reminded of in our still affluent, if declining affluence, and that is that education is what gets you to the top. And what they have in those tiger economies, and what they had in Scotland, and that period where in Scotland led in education in the world probably, was a strong sense of the intrinsic value of a certain amount of core knowledge and core skills, and a strong sense of how the entire population needed to be brought up to the level where they had those core values, core knowledge and core skills. But they also had a very clear sense that it was necessary and highly desirable to get the best out of every single student. And that included the top students. And curiously, there's not such a high regard for success, regardless of what people say. In this culture, in our culture, it seems muted, even denied to some extent. And I said in the York debate that I was referring to that we're very comfortable with the notion of a sporting elite. We're comfortable with the idea of a performing arts elite. But we're not very comfortable with the idea of an intellectual elite. And I put this to Kate Pickett and to the other debaters at York University, and she admitted that she wasn't comfortable with the idea of an educational elite, which is a bit odd because she's in a university that's just spent £500,000 joining itself to the Russell Group. And the Russell Group exists for one reason and one reason only, and that is to badge itself as a set of elite institutions and to badge their students, therefore, as part of an intellectual elite. So we're denying reality in those circumstances. And the problem is that discomfort that it brings me, education is not intrinsically an egalitarian process. You can raise everybody up together to a certain level, but the education process, some people gain a lot more from it than others. And of course, you're not going to raise everybody to the same level. We need higher order skills and higher order knowledge. We need brain surgeons, we need architects, we need engineers. And not everybody is going to be able to develop the knowledge to develop those skills. And when people do develop those skills in every society in the world now and in the past, they will get privileges from it and get material benefits from it. So nobody in government, nobody in education, in truth, is trying to aim for equality of outcomes. They're aiming for equality of opportunity. And I would be wholly in favour of equality of opportunity, and indeed there's pretty much equanimity across the political spectrum in favour of equality of opportunity. But then you have to ask what equality of opportunity means. And it means different things to different people when you explore it. For some people it means simply that all people who have attained a similar level have an even chance of access to the opportunities resulting from attaining that level. The second group, moving it up the scale a bit, would be people who want to invest in special programs to expand the number of people who get access to opportunities by raising the game of the economically disadvantaged students to get them to the level of those who have had more economic advantages. And a third level is positive discrimination in favour of the economically disadvantaged. Now it seems to me those two levels are, the first two levels are clearly consistent with the pursuit of excellence. And even positive discrimination sits happily with the pursuit of excellence, insofar as it's individual admissions tutors in universities, for example, choosing to give priority to or preferring a student with lower qualifications who's come from a poor background in favour of a better off student with higher qualifications, because they judge that that person, that lower economic status pupil has greater potential. That's perfectly consistent with the pursuit of excellence. But what I think is less happy is where there are institutional targets or quotas for such cases, because then education is being made to make up for the ills of our society, and that is inconsistent with a ruthless focus on excellence. Still more problematic is the contention that everyone has talents and that those talents are of equal value. And I thought I would quote here from a leading blogger in the education world, who blogs a great deal. And her blog reads, and I quote, "I think that excellence and achievement and standards are lower than they could be, because the interests and talents of so many children are not being developed to their full. Because those children are not up to the expected narrowly defined bar in certain areas of learning defined by government as important for the economy and our culture." That's quite a long quote. Now, sort of dissect that a bit, because what that blogger doesn't say is what those skills are, which are defined by what she calls a narrowly defined bar. And what I think she must be talking about, because they're the only skills that the government does define, are literacy and numeracy skills. And it absolutely chills me to the marrow that somebody suggests that these are only narrowly defined skills in certain areas of learning defined by government as important for the economy and our culture, because they're defined by almost everybody in the world as important. And I could take that blogger immediately to classes where the majority of students would not have those skills, would not have crossed that narrowly defined bar. And where I would take the blogger to be sure that I got such students would be a young offenders institution. I've got a lot of experience in teaching in young offender institutions, and typically the young people in those places have low literacy and numeracy skills. And to pretend to them, or to pretend to any other young people in that situation, that they have other skills and talents which are equally important and are going to be valued by society as important, is consigning them to the margins of society, which of course in the case of those who are already in the youth justice system, they've already got to. But their only hope, and the only hope for people who are in that category, likely to be in that category in the future, is much more imaginative programs to get their basic skills up to an appropriate level. And that blogger defined the problem as being a problem only for the sort of lower tier of learners, the people whose talents were not recognized. But there's a problem further up the scale as well. Academics that I've spoken to in the last couple of years in a very wide range of disciplines, I think of maths, natural sciences, modern foreign languages, classics, engineering, so a very wide range of disciplines, have said to me that they're worried that their students are arriving at university without the core knowledge of their subjects, which allows them to undertake the undergraduate studies which they have to take when they arrive at university. And increasingly in top universities, I'm talking about Oxford in this case, people are having to have remedial classes to bring them up to speed in order to address their undergraduate studies. And I've asked a lot of educationalists over the last couple of years, what do you think about this? And a minority are worried by it and acknowledge that there's something wrong. The great majority deny that it's a problem, but they don't deny that that's a problem because they're affirming the achievement of those young people, saying, no, they're absolutely first class, there is no problem. They're implying that the intellectually able are privileged, and therefore there can't be a problem because they can sort themselves out. they cannot be a priority because they're educationally privileged. And it's an attitude which explains the problem that I've identified because it causes the problem that I've identified. So the problem with equality as a goal in education really comes down to this. If governments want to make a more equal society, and I think they should personally, but if they want to do so, they've got two levers at their command. One is levers which level up through special programs or benefits or a whole range of things in different areas of policy. And the other are levers which level down. And they level down, for example, in fiscal policy by tax. And it's quite acceptable and indeed done commonly in most countries in the world that you level down by higher tax levels for people on higher incomes. But you don't level down in education. Nobody supposes or suggests that we should level down in education. It's an extraordinarily dangerous idea. But the effect of some of what I've been identifying is leveling down. And I picked up a newspaper in a train the other day because I saw a headline on the column about column of readers' letters. And I picked up this, and I thought it was worth quoting to you. And it was from a student who said, "I came from a poor family. I worked hard at school and did all my homework. However, the school's focus was on the poorest achievers, and the few of us getting good grades were completely ignored. I was even chastised once for doing too much work. To quote my teacher, 'We're not here to provide you with work.'" And too often what I've identified and what I've talked about this morning is that because levering up is extremely difficult in education, it's hard work, and it's of course work that people undertake, and we've heard some of that described this morning. But because it's hard, people react as if embarrassed by the unavoidably unequal benefits which people derive from education, which pupils derive from education. Some senior educationists are unwilling to commit themselves wholeheartedly to maximizing the achievements and the subsequent privilege which come from those achievements of the high performers. They're reluctant to support that process. The result is leveling down, in effect, and leveling down is the absolute antithesis of a pro-education culture. So, just to finish off, if we want a pro-education culture, it'll be about the way we do things, and as well as what we do. It'll be about affecting culture. And if I think back to the National Literacy Strategy that I was mentioning earlier, it had a main curriculum tool, which was the literacy hour, which had an extraordinary effect because it somehow grabbed the attention, not just of teachers and indeed of pupils on a daily basis, but of mothers, of parents, and it was talked much about at the school gate. It was probably the curriculum reform that touched people or excited people more than any other in the post-war period. It didn't affect everybody that way, mind you. I remember my 6-year-old daughter saying to her anxiously, "Do you like the literacy hour, darling?" And she said, "No, I hate it. It's numbers, numbers, numbers all the time." So some people didn't quite get it, and I've never got to the bottom of what it was in that case. It hasn't held her back, as it happens. But anyway, it did have a cultural impact, and that was part of the success of the program. And there are other programs in education which are having a cultural impact, like Teach First, for example, which is engaging a lot of bright students in ways that they wouldn't have been engaged before in the education system and having an impact on the culture. And there are overt expressions of pro-education culture which need to be supported and need to be promoted. So, for example, nearly every ethnic minority community in the country has Saturday schools, and they're, as I say, an overt expression of a pro-education culture. And that's what we need to support, because what we need is a culture where people see education as something that they are responsible for, not something that's done to them or for them by government or by teachers, but something that they're responsible for. Because the truth is, I think, that we will, to a considerable extent, get the education that we deserve, and we need to show that we deserve better. Thank you.